Ladies and gentlemen, we're rejoining after our comfort stop and a cup of tea or coffee, I hope. We're coming now to our third speaker for the day, young Michael Watson. He's from Queensland. He's taken quite a keen interest in social credit. Now, social credit's been mentioned throughout the addresses today, and not to be confused with what they're happening up in Red China at the moment. They've got a social credit system there, which is more of a social debit system where you're monitored by thousands of cameras all over the countryside. If you walk across the road in the incorrect space where there's not a pedestrian crossing, you might lose a couple of points. And on the other hand, if you suck up to some of the authorities, you'll gain a couple of points. So that is the way their system goes. And we take great pride in suggesting that our social credit, as formed by C.H. Douglas, who's again been mentioned earlier today, is vastly different. Social credit, the League of Rights actually grew out of the social credit teachings. It was sort of an action program in the society to try and achieve the aims of social credit. There'll be much more of that available on our League of Rights library if you'd like to check it out at alor.org. Michael, he's been quite keen on that. He's been working with a couple of his colleagues up in Queensland there to extend his studies on the matter. And a couple of years ago, he went with a small group from Australia over to the United States, where there was a world conference held in America about the universal basic income. You've probably been hearing a little bit about that, because this is a scheme where as more and more machines take over the jobs of the humans, that means those people aren't earning a wage. Machines don't take a wage, and follow it through to its logical conclusion. The more and more people are displaced by a machine means they're less wage earners. So how the dickens are they going to afford to live? Where are they going to get their money to live? And the national dividend is an alternative to the aims in the universal basic income. And the national dividend is a social credit concept. There's more about that later, but Michael might touch on some of that today. But Michael attended the national weekend that we held last year in Adelaide, and he actually proposed a toast to the League of Rights. So he's got more than his foot in the door with us. So he's here today to base on what we've heard from the first two speakers. We've understood the problems, and what are we going to do about it? That we need to get some action going to regain or hold on to the rights and freedoms that we have. So we're looking forward to hearing you, Michael. So ladies and gentlemen, Michael Watson.
Oh, thank you very much, Ken and Arnis, for giving me the honour and privilege of speaking at this year's Australian League of Rights Conference. So I guess I'll begin. The theme that was set for my talk will be how the people could regain control of the forces of the Crown through effective and genuine political democracy. But what I want to suggest is that before anything like effective and genuine democracy is even possible, the Crown must be allowed to recover its proper powers and jurisdiction. In other words, we need a real monarchy with teeth if we are ever to expect any real improvement to our social, economic, political and cultural situation. And only under a monarchy with real executive power can real and genuine democracy and freedom be established and maintained. This is very much in line with C.H. Douglas's analysis of the political situation both in his time, early 20th century, and also where we find ourselves today in 2020. C.H. Douglas stated in his work, Realistic Constitutionalism, whom I will be quoting throughout this speech, that, quote, constitutionalism is an extension of the very comprehensive subject we call social credit, close quote. Why? Why is that so? Because constitutionalism deals with what constitutes the correct structure of society. It is grounded in objective reality and in laws that transcend human thinking and which must be rediscovered, obeyed, and correctly applied if we are to have a successful society. For this talk on the subject of politics and systems of governance, I will be focusing on the Anglo-political tradition of Great Britain, from which Australia stems. In relation to this, I will also be talking about and explaining the social credit, economic and monetary reform proposals by C.H. Douglas, which has been previously mentioned in the two previous speakers. The historical political institution and institutions of the United Kingdom, and by extension Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and all other Commonwealth countries, has been what Douglas referred to as the Trinitarian constitution of the three civil powers of the King, the House of Lords, and House of Commons, with each possessing and exercising real power, with the King being the primary and overarching holder and empowered custodian of the same. It is this constitution which, according to Douglas, marked the most prosperous, stable, and successful times Great Britain has ever experienced, but has been gradually eroded and destroyed by the rise of the supremacy of the House of Commons over all other institutions, especially that of the monarch. Douglas explains this again in Realistic Constitutionalism, quote, when England had a genuine Trinitarian constitution with three interrelated and interacting loci of sovereignty, the King, the Lords spiritual and temporal, and the Commons, these ideas were instinctive, and those were the days of Merry England. Since the Whig revolutions of 1644 and 1688 and the foundation of the Bank of England under the characteristically false auspices in 1694, the Constitution has been insidiously sapped by the dark forces which knew its strength and the obstacle which it offered to treachery. We now have only the mere shell of the Constitution, single-chamber government dominated by cartels and trade unions, based on unitary sovereignty, to which the next step is the secular, materialistic, totalitarian state, the final embodiment of power without responsibility, close quote, from Douglas. The decline and loss of the power of the monarch in Britain and the concluding rise of the supremacy of Parliament was a long, gradual process over hundreds of years. It started with King Henry VIII's summoning of Parliament to loot the Catholic Church and its monasteries in England to enrich the members of Parliament and the ascendant mercantile class and money power, which backed King Henry in the Parliament. The growing power of the Protestant parliamentarians, merchants, and money power of London later challenged the direct rule of King Charles I. This resulted in a civil war between the royalists and parliamentarians, culminating in the king being forcibly deposed and executed in 1649 and be replaced by the Puritan dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell further looted and persecuted the church and peasantry, thus further cementing the power of the merchants and the domination of money. Cromwell was later deposed and executed, and the Stuart dynasty was restored under King Charles II in 1660, who attempted to restore the power of the monarch, but such a venture failed in the end when his successor, James II, was forcibly deposed by the parliamentarians and merchants in 1688 and replaced by the Protestant William of Orange, who favoured their cause. So thus, the royal power of the English monarchy was destroyed and were made, for the most part, powerless figureheads rubber stamping the supreme will of the House of Commons. Some future British monarchs, such as Queen Victoria and Edward VIII, until he was also deposed, exercised only very limited and fleeting executive power over the state. The money power in Parliament in England was triumphant. The political partisans of the turbulent time of 1600s Britain became known as Cavaliers and Roundheads. the earlier being those in support of High Church Anglicanism or Catholicism and an empowered monarchy of the Stuarts, and the latter being those who favoured Calvinism and Puritanism and the supremacy of Parliament over England. The conservative political term Tory originally referred to Irish rebels and royalists who were resisting the Puritan Cromwell regime, ironically. Similarly, the political term Whig originally referred to the parliamentarians and merchants. Thus, the true and original conservative tradition of Anglo nations and peoples is the Trinitarian system of upper house and a democratic lower house, which are both limited and subject to the monarch, the High Church, and common law. What the Trinitarian system of government means is that the principle of supremacy of Parliament is erroneous and dangerous. For example, that a Parliament elected on a majority should be allowed to enact any policy which contravenes the common law. In order to safeguard the common law, it should be entrusted to the Lords spiritual and temporal, that being the Christian clergy and a classically educated aristocracy, as well as the king. Douglas explains this again in Realistic Constitutionalism, quote, "Speaking not, of course, as a lawyer, but as a student of history and organization, it is my opinion that the restoration of the supremacy of common law, the removal of encroachments upon it, and the establishment of the principle that legislation by the House of Commons impinging upon it is ultra vires, is an urgent necessity. The locus of sovereignty over common law is not in the electorate, because common law did not derive from the electorate, and indeed antedated any electorate in the modern sense. In the main, it derived from the medieval church, perhaps not directly, but from the climate of opinion which the church disseminated. The strengthening and elevation of common law and its repository in the care of an effective second non-elective chamber, clearly defined limits must be placed on the power of a House of Commons elected on a majority principle. It appears to me that a properly empowered and constituted House of Lords, spiritual and temporal, is the natural guardian of common law, as the barons demonstrated at Runnymede." Close quote. At the apex of the Trinitarian state is, of course, the king and royal family, the sovereign head of state and master and commander of the armed forces, who reigns over and directs the houses of parliament and all other organs of the state. The kingship stands above and overrides that of the rule of politicians in parliament and maintains a check on their power and subjects them to a higher power greater than themselves. The kings attain their office via hereditary succession and are trained for political life from a very young age. Most members of the House of Lords similarly attain their positions via hereditary succession. The importance, value, and effectiveness of the hereditary principle in ensuring good governments cannot be denied, for reasons being: it prevents the popular demagoguery, greed, and political opportunism of elected politicians from corrupting and ruining the state. It enshrines the utmost importance of the natural human family of husband, wife, and children as the basis for the state and society. It develops and fosters national culture and tradition through generations of experience and learning being passed on, and it ensures political stability and longevity rather than chaos and constantly changing politics. Douglas also explained this in Realistic Constitutionalism, quote, "The essential soul of a nation is in its character, its culture and tradition. The king is the natural embodiment of honors and sanctions, of culture and tradition, as such is naturally the supreme commander of the armed forces, so that our problem seems to resolve itself into a real understanding and restoration of the functions we have allowed to decay," close quote. However, this executive power held by the monarch is not absolute in the sense that he can do as he or she pleases without any restraint or accountability. The king's power is subject to the rule of common law and is checked by the laws of God and his church, which he or she is formed by, and the legal restraints of the Trinitarian Constitution and its Houses of Parliament. And whilst the danger of ending up with an incompetent or tyrannical king is a possibility, I say it's better to take the risk of possibly being ruled by one bad hereditary king than likely end up being ruled by hundreds of bad elected politicians. The Catholic Church, and later the High Anglican Church in England, exercised a pivotal role in forming and guiding the conscience and rule of the monarchs and defining the universal common law of the Commonwealth under which the King and Parliament must operate and not alter to their liking. Douglas explains this in his work, The Realistic Position of the Church of England, quote, "On this particular subject of the role which the Christian Church can and ought to play in the political life of a nation, grounded on Christian principles, Douglas observed the following. The divine right of kings, which with improvements has been taken over by the socialists, was strictly derivative and contingent on the agreement of the Church. That this had a real validity is amply proved by the success of European civilization in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, during which period the balance of spiritual and temporal powers was a living organism," close quote. Since the rise of the money power in England 400 years ago with the execution of Charles I, the institution of the British monarchy and its effective power has been gradually eroded ever since, with the last of the monarchy's real power being eviscerated in 1936 with the forced abdication of King Edward VIII. Douglas explained this in his article, The Victory of His Majesty King Edward VIII, quote, "This would appear, broadly speaking, to have been Douglas's view as well. At the time of the abdication of King Edward VIII, he wrote, the institution of monarchy in the form in which we know it has been blown to atoms, not by the King Edward, but by those who wish to use the shell of an authority which has obviously passed from it, as a screen behind which they could govern for their own ends, without scruple and without responsibility." He went on to speak of the breakup of the institution of monarchy, describing it as an anachronism in its present form, close quote. As another example of this closer to home, the state of Victoria, Australia, issued an amendment to its constitution in 2003, which stripped the power of Her Majesty's Governor of that state to dissolve Parliament at will and without the consent of the state premier or a no confidence motion. This is poignant and ironic, considering the current Victorian state premier's draconian and totalitarian lockdown policies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So thus, the British monarchy has been reduced to a purely ceremonial figurehead with all the trappings and aesthetics of royalty, but is a monarchy in name only, with power chiefly being exercised by the Prime Minister and members of Parliament, and all in the name of the people. And democracy, as we're told by the official historical narrative and propaganda by the elites. But this is not true. The power of the kings in England was stripped by the forces of the merchant class, the private banking sector, and the financial oligarchs of London for the enrichment and empowerment of the same. Douglas explains this again in Realistic Constitutionalism, quote, of degeneracy from a marvelous constitution in the last 300 years, accompanied by the atrophy of a sense of continuity. The idea that history is a disconnected episode instead of being, as it is, crystallized policy. The main agency through which that degeneracy has operated has been the Bank of England and its credit system, the Ways and Means account, the national debt, and the usurpation of the taxation power. All these matters have gone to magnify the powers of bribery and corruption, and these in turn have logically been directed against the strength of the pre-Cromwellian constitution, close quote. So thus, gone was merry England, where its peasantry once enjoyed 1/3 of the year as public holidays, to being socially and economically disadvantaged and crushed by the rise of the bourgeois mercantile class and financial oligarchs of London. The peasantry is uprooted from the land and reduced to wage slaves, and the working men became either propertyless or debt-loaded wards of high finance. Catholics and high Anglicans were persecuted, and the classical arts and traditional folk culture were suppressed and sacked. And the ascendancy of and monopoly of the money power has now in modern times grown to such an extent that the natural human family itself has been broken up and suppressed, at least among the lower income classes, by crippling high costs of living and housing due to bank debt and the forcing of both mothers and fathers to work outside the home in the name of so-called women's liberation. The promotion and legalization of no-fault divorce, abortion, euthanasia, contraception, feminism, and same-sex marriage by the same financial oligarchs for their own benefit has also contributed to the destruction of the family and Western society as a whole. Life has become cheap, sterile, fickle, materialistic, noisy, stressful, and busier than ever, and has become a dog-eat-dog competition for money, jobs, and even family establishment and financial security that older generations took for granted in their youth. Cultural identities, communities, and family structures have been so systematically broken down that people have been reduced to powerless and weak, atomized individuals. Every government must by default have a logos underpinning its very reason for existence. And the logos and religion of the government of the financial oligarchy and its politicians is that of the love, pursuit, and worship of money above all else for the sake of that same oligarchy. Thus, the human citizens under their rule are reduced to mere economic units, all destined for the purpose of production and consumption. The golden calf has once again been erected in the place of God. But let's not forget what our Lord himself said in the first book of Timothy 6:10. For the desire of money is the root of all evils, which some coveting have erred from the faith and have entangled themselves in many sorrows. Close quote. Douglas explains the nature of the plutocratic oligarchy we are governed by now in his work, Security, Institutional and Personal. Quote, "We are governed in the aristocratic tradition by a hypocritical and selfish oligarchy with one idea and one fundamental idea only, the ascendancy of money and the essential monopoly of it. So thus, the mother country and the Commonwealth nations are now governed by the oligarchies of faceless men and women who manipulate and direct political, economic and social life through the media and elected politicians via the so-called democratic process. These politicians, in most cases, are opportunists by nature, who acquire their office through shrewd and smooth-talking charisma, as well as by financial backing by corporations, financial institutions, lobby groups, and public policy think tanks. An example of this in Australia, one amongst many, is the Grattan Institute, an organisation that promotes the interests of big business and high finance in politics and receives funding from state and federal governments, universities, corporations, and banks. Big business and financial interests often deliberately provide funding to both opposing mainstream political parties in Parliament in order to create a controlled opposition and a facade of political accountability and popular determination. But no matter which party is elected, the money power is always in charge of policy behind the scenes for its own benefit. Opposing political leaders and parties will frequently tout growth and jobs, or jobs and growth, whichever one comes first, at every election, claiming to correct errors or improve governance over that of the previous elected government. The future policy visions and planning of elected politicians is often short-sighted and focused on just getting re-elected at the next election a few years later. Any Tom, Dick or Harry can run for office and get elected as long as he can talk a good line and have financial backing from the money power to fund his or her election campaign. The House of Commons, or representatives as in Australia, must work in committee with hundreds of members involved. New policies or legislation must be endlessly debated, fought over, and voted upon just to get enacted. Such a political process is incapacitated, delayed by division, incompetence, and inaction. Just judging from my own experience in running a body corporate committee for a small unit complex, committees are prone to disorder in fighting corruption and dysfunction. One of the most dangerous aspects of liberal democracy in its absolute form and the absolute rule of the House of Commons or Representatives is that the voting people are placed under the illusion that as long as they exercise their right to vote in elections, no tyranny can ever manifest, and an almost absolute legitimacy is given to politicians and all they legislate, say, and do in public political office. This bestows upon politicians and parliaments vast power that is beyond what any absolute monarchs or dictators ever dreamt of. Under this system of elected government, the danger of totalitarianism is even more present when, for example, governments can mandate possibly ineffective or dangerous vaccines or impose lockdowns during supposed pandemics via fear or panic mongering, despite the virus in question having a very low death rate. In turn, the people or the masses, manipulated or directed by whatever financial oligarchy, media, or capricious and emotional thoughts or reactions, can vote or be directed to vote for whichever party or policy they like, no matter how foolish or immoral it is, and regardless of the consequences for themselves and the nation. And having a population, especially today, that is often ignorant, whether socially and economically illiterate or morally degenerate, makes this system of popular governance all the more dangerous. Douglas explains this also in Realistic Constitutionalism, quote, Vox Populi, this voice of the people, is not only not Vox Dei, that is voice of God, but such empirical psychologists as Gustave Le Bon have demonstrated beyond all reasonable doubt that in itself it is far more likely to be Vox Diaboli, so the voice of evil or voice of the devil, close quote. Such a fraudulent and corruptible political system as this fosters both a populace and class of politicians without any responsibility or accountability for their actions and the consequences thereof, such as irresponsible and dangerous mass migration, construction of faulty or inadequate infrastructure, or a reckless and inefficient use of funds or resources. Since the full embrace of absolute rule of democratically elected committees, Western nations have been experiencing a disintegration and loss of their cultural identity and moral values. Religious faith has also diminished, and respect and maintenance of the legitimate authority in the family and wider society has been breaking down. This is because liberal democracy by nature promotes the philosophy of liberalism, where anything goes and nothing is permanent, and all inhibitions and obstacles to freedom of vice and avarice must be torn down. Any policy or legislation, regardless of how insane or immoral it is, can be approved with a show of hands. Such moral and cultural decline has been more so the case in Western countries in a lot of ways than even in communist and former communist countries. If we are serious about preventing the decline and downfall of Christian Western civilization, we have to accept the fact that universal liberal democracy as it currently stands, it is the problem and not the solution. Douglas made this point in Realistic Constitutionalism, saying, quote, make it imperative that we put the framework of our house in order to enable us to rectify both our housekeeping and our external business. Our present situation is not adventitious. It is the outcome of venomous hatred and envy of our indigenous qualities. If anyone is foolish enough to suppose that the prestige of this country and the empire, and with them the welfare of the population, can be restored by an appeal to an anonymous, irresponsible and misinstructed ballot box democracy, I can assure them that if their opinion should prevail and our destinies be submitted to decision by that process, The outcome is a mathematical certainty, our final eclipse, close quote. The ancient Greek and Christian philosophers such as Plato and St. Thomas Aquinas viewed democracy to be the worst form of government, with monarchy being the best and aristocracy being second best. Thomas Aquinas called for a mixed form of all three, similar to the Trinitarian form spoken of by Douglas. However, democracy can be genuine, effective, and work for the common good of the people as long as it is well ordered and kept in its proper place. The power of democratic committees must be limited and regulated by an overarching higher power, and the voting franchise responsible for electing these committees must be public and limited to qualified persons who are knowledgeable in governance, classical arts, economics, headship of families, and property ownership. The Democratic Assembly must be regulated and guided by that of the monarchy, an unelected House of Lords or Senators, common law, and the Christian Church to prevent it from corrupting and ruining the nation. C.H. Douglas argues that for government to be truly effective and just, there needs to be a democracy of policy and a hierarchy of administration. So notice the distinct difference between the two. In other words, the people must determine what their real physical material, that is their real physical, material, and cultural needs are, and the policies that are needed to support those needs, and a hierarchical form of government needs to be established to implement those policies, especially the policies of Douglas' social credit. C.H. Douglas says in his work, The Nature of Democracy, quote, "Nothing but the rehabilitation of democracy in a genuine sense and with an understanding of its limits will enable social credit to become an actual fact," close quote. Great early 20th century Anglo-French writer, historian, distributist, and even politician, Hilaire Belloc, says that democracy only works best when it is small and limited. Otherwise, it devolves into a state of plutocracy. I quote the following from him in his splendid book, Monarchy, A Study of Louis XIV, quote, "Democracy, alas, it is possible only in small states, and even those must enjoy exceptional defenses, moral or material, if they are to survive. So defended, whether by natural obstacles or by an agreement among their neighbors, democracies very limited in scale have endured. Andorra, after at least 1,000 years in her mountain valleys, is still here. But for the most part, the lesser communities are absorbed into the greater, and not till these break up can democracy in the smaller fragments reappear," close quote. In this same book, Belloc says that historically, most nations, that's historically throughout all of mankind's history, and most nations have either been governed by monarchies or plutocratic republics. I quote him again, quote, "The human story as a whole tells of kingship on the one hand, on the other of republics under accepted authority of the rich, of enduring democracy hardly anything. Of these two main forms, monarchy and aristocracy. Monarchy is the commoner by far. Men perpetually associate themselves under individual rulers. They only here and there, exceptionally, form states ordered by a ruling class. This prevalence of monarchy through the ages is due to two forces. First, that men think of themselves at heart as equals in right. Next, that men armed for battle are organized for civil action, can best achieve their objects under a leader. Filled with an obscure resentment against the power of mere wealth or even caste, men will applaud and follow one who shall be the master of their masters. The monarch incarnates the common man in his multitude as well as the whole society over which he himself presides. Also, men can only act as if they are embrigaded under a hierarchy of command, leading up to one commander. Nearly all great common enterprises must be ordered so. And in the supreme test of war, armies are led and battles are won by a single will and brain," close quote. Ballock then goes on to say that an absolute established monarchy with real executive power is the best means for curbing and defeating the plutocratic money power. Quote, "Such is the sway of monarchy over men's minds, but there is one practical quality about it which, in social effect, outweighs all others and is connected with all its qualities. Monarchy is the sole effective protection in a large state of the common citizen against the mastery of wealth. Napoleon summarized that truth in lapidary fashion. Monarchy, he said, is the one device discovered by man for the curbing of the money power. Age after age has proved this true, not only by reason, but by experiment. Seeing what wealth can do, nothing can check its control of society save the presence of a master, too rich to be bribed and too strong to be beaten down. By all this, we see the meaning and advantage of monarchy to the state, to organize mankind, for which it secures representation and a personal voice, protection, direction, and order under authority. Monarchy is also the political guarantee of the governed, and Charles Stuart, as Charles I, spoke that truth on the scaffold when he said he died for the people of England, close quote. It is this contrast between the monarchical power and the money power, like the battle between David and Goliath, that I will talk about in relation to the monetary reform program of C.H. Douglas, that is, social credit. One of the main policies of social credit is to establish national sovereignty over the nation's financial system and its creation and issue of money, so it is not beholden to international private banks. This kind of financial sovereignty is most essential to maintaining any kind of national sovereignty, without which the nation is held in bondage by private debt, regardless of its official claims to sovereignty. This will allow the nation to create its own credit to fund its public services and infrastructure projects. Another central policy agenda of social credit, as was mentioned in our previous presentations, is the establishment of a national dividend paid to every citizen as a shareholder in the nation's total production and profit. This dividend will provide every citizen with basic financial security and stave off poverty and ensure there is sufficient credit to buy all the goods and services being produced. This income detached from work is becoming a practical necessity now due to mass technological automation of jobs, as Ken previously mentioned. So full employment is becoming no longer sustainable. The amount issued is calculated to the nation's total production of goods and services, which are in high excess now due to increased production from technological automation. The private banking sector and its money lending would need to be regulated so to prevent inflation, since that is the main cause of inflationary pressures. Far from being an enemy of honest business and private enterprise within just bounds, Douglas social credit and the state will encourage and support private enterprise, especially small businesses, which are the basis of the private sector economy. The national dividend will give enterprising individuals financial stability to start their own businesses. All or most of the welfare state will be abolished and replaced by the national dividend, which will result in less bureaucracy and smaller government. The dividend is not means tested and will be received on top of the wages one receives from work. If too many people are idle without working, then the dividend will reduce, it will go down due to decreased production, thus indicating the need for more labor. One of the main philosophical tenets of Douglas social credit is that the purpose of the economy is to provide all necessary goods and services with the least amount of trouble to everyone. Work is a means to an end and not an end unto itself. For according to the philosophy of Douglas social credit, the true definition and measure of freedom in a given society and its political and economic order is its ability and willingness to provide basic and sufficient financial security and leisure outside that of servile labor to all citizens, so they may pursue and cultivate their spiritual, familial, cultural, and personal lives and gifts. So leisure is the basis of culture and of any civilization worthy of the name. However, This freedom of leisure is not to be abused by citizens or used for vice or narcissism. Thus, it is the role and purpose of the empowered monarchy, along with the church and other legislatures and judicial organs of the state, to enforce order and maintain the common good in the body politic. Thus, Holy Scripture again instructs us regarding the divinely willed purpose of the king and state in second book of Peter 2:14-17. Be ye subject, therefore, to every human creature for God's sake, whether it be to the king as excelling, or to governors as sent by for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of the good. For so is the will of God, that by doing well you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and as not making liberty a cloak for malice, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Close quote. The first book of Timothy 2:2 also explains the role of kingship. It says, for kings and for all that are in high station, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all piety and chastity. Close quote. One of the greatest advantages of real monarchy is that the monarch has real power and means to exercise their authority and implement and enact policies and changes without being bogged down by the corruption, divisions, and sluggishness that typically plagues democratically elected parliaments. Because of this, an empowered monarchy has the best means to implement social credit and national sovereign control of money. Getting social credit policies implemented via the democratic process has been tried and failed repeatedly because the democratic system is too corruptible and structurally ineffective for implementing such far-reaching and radical reforms. So my main point of this presentation is that if we want to have any hope of salvaging and restoring our Christian Western civilization, real and active executive power of a Christian hereditary monarchy, as well as the Anglo-Commonwealth's tradition of the Trinitarian system of government, of Christian kingship, lords and commons, must be restored and strengthened, and democracy must be kept in its proper and limited place. So many of you must be thinking that what I'm proposing in this presentation is politically impossible, fantastical, and unrealistic. Some of you may be thinking that getting rid of liberal democracy now will result in communist or totalitarian states instead. Well, perhaps in the immediate here and now that is true, unfortunately. But ultimately, we must in principle, as our long-term plan, have this Christian philosophical ideal of real monarchy and economic equity as our final endgame political goal. Getting some mildly conservative politicians or parties elected here or there, ultimately in the end, is not going to save our civilization. Now, I'm not saying not to do that. Certainly in the meantime, strive to get real conservative MPs elected that can try and moderate and slow the progress of the enemy. But only true civilizational metanoia and political structural change can effect that. We must play our own small parts in our places and times to eventually bring about this desperately needed change in direction of our civilization. Revolution and counter-revolution and history works in generations and centuries. The current socio-political order cannot and will not last, as history has repeatedly shown. So we must prepare the Christian monarchical and social credit political and economic orders to be ready to offer as an alternative when the current socio-political order eventually falls on its sword, and it most certainly will sooner or later. As far as getting the reforms of Douglas social credit accepted and implemented, other more effective means beyond the fickle and incapacitated democratic process should be sought, such as, for example, making contact with and influencing high-ranking government bureaucrats, finance ministers, or high-profile and very wealthy families or individuals who may be interested or sympathetic to its cause. So we, as the people of the Anglo cultural and political tradition, must make it our business to, through whatever it means, to restore the constitution that nourished and developed our Christian European culture and create and built our civilization of true and genuine freedom, order, justice, peace, and equity for all. C.H. Douglas also made this point in Realistic Constitutionalism. We grew a constitution, and our business is to free it from the weeds which are choking it and to restore its powers and effectiveness.
Michael, to me, if you like, the personal responsibility that vests in the individual to actually exercise their choices and their freedoms, and something like, say, common law. There's a distance between, if you like, absolute monarchy, or absolute might be the wrong word, but let's just say a significant or real monarchy that you're alluding to. To me, the kingdom is for each individual. Each individual is a sacred and unique human being. And
Yes.
The whole purpose of government is to actually provide, like the road. They're supposed to provide the road, the bridges and the walkways and things like that. They're not there to govern as an absolute authority over us, but to provide the environment for us to actually exercise our own choices. That to me is what is Christian. And that sort of comes back to the thought of the natural law. I know Robert touched on this, the canon law, these supreme laws that are actually over and above the black letter law, if you like, of government and institutions. Now, in Victoria, I think it's a good illustration because there was a division of power. There was actually in my view, before 2003, the upper house had the authority. This is really relevant because 2003 is only a dog's watch. It's only a few minutes ago. 2003, the upper house could refuse supply. And if they can refuse supply to the lower house, what they're saying is that you may have the majority vote today, but we've got our finger on the pulse and we're not necessarily confident with you. And if necessary, the population as individuals could approach the governor and the governor could remove the commission. And so that idea of it was to actually, if you like, diffuse the situation. The Queen is there, or the Queen's representative, the governor, is there to diffuse a critical situation. Now, they've deconstructed that, 2003.
Yes.
And to me, the fact is that, say, Kerr's letters, what was actually going on in his mind before the Whitlam dismissal, I've just recently looked at them, they're a beautiful illustration of the actual role of a Governor-General to be impartial. He can't even choose between one house and the other. So it really is a challenge. I guess it's a challenge because to me you're presenting monarchy as being more than itself, if you like leadership. It's almost like there's something that's over and above, when in actual fact they're only people. They're only people, and they can only do. So your thoughts, please, Michael.
I don't disagree with you there, Arnis. First of all, the monarch, the king, is meant to be a servant, not a ruler in the sense that he just governs for himself and the people are his mere property. He is a servant of the people, and Jesus, when Jesus came, he said he came not to rule but to serve, like a servant of the servants of God. So the king, in the same sense, rules in that manner. I also point out with what you're saying with as far as public policy goes and the role of the individual citizens. One of the pillars of Catholic social doctrine is the subsidiarity. So that means that whatever things, tasks, or projects or services can be managed best on the local level should be managed on the local level. So you have a decentralization of power or administration in that sense. Let the local entities manage the things they manage, and let the upper echelons of the state manage things that they manage best. And obviously the king, the monarch, manage things that the monarch manages best, such as the overarching interests of the nation, like the armed forces and the financial system, and major infrastructure projects that affect the whole country. etc. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Michael. There's a question on the floor. Could you summarise your political journey from your teenage years to the current position that supports rule by king, as in the Old Testament?
Well, it's a long story. When I was just a teenager and at high school, I was no different to most other teenagers. I was just very, very conventional in my thinking. I just blindly believed in modern universal liberal democracy as it stands. I believed in climate change. I believed in everything the television and politicians told me. I was just zombie. But it was probably started in my last year of high school. I was going through some difficult personal challenges in my life growing up and after school as well. I started to seriously think about political and social questions, and I started just after I finished high school. I started getting interested in Christianity, and I started practicing the Catholic faith, and that really adopting that in this day and age pretty much forces you to go against the grain, so to speak, against the official logos that governs us, which is a false logos. So it was from there that I really started to research Christian history and its side, and it's from there that I started to get interested in monarchy and the ideal of it, with Christ being a monarch, and then the Old Testament monarchs, and then the Christian monarchs. So it was from Christianity that I started to get interested in the thing, and then a few years later, as my economic situation kept getting more and more difficult, I might say, challenging, because of the current economic situation is very it's structure of sin, pretty much. It's ruled by mammon. It was from there that I started to seriously get interested in the social teachings of the Catholic Church, which are absolutely marvelous. No other religion in the world has developed such an elaborate social teaching as that. That's just a teaching on economics, economic justice, equity, all that sort of thing. And it's from there that I actually, it was actually through Bernard Gaynor, actually. I credit Bernard Gaynor for this. Thank you, Bernard. He actually put me on to Dr. Oliver Haydorn, who was researching social credit and written a number of books on it. So I met up with Dr. Haydorn, 5 years ago now it is. And he told me all there is to know about social credit, and I was sold, because when you, particularly as a young man, these days you just got on the economic or the social or spiritual level that the world is just rigged against you. You just become a non-entity today. So it was those difficult, hard challenges in my life that really compelled me to think outside the square, think outside the box, and look for alternatives. And thanks be to the grace of God, I did find the true alternatives. So yeah, I hope that answers your question well, Jeffrey McKee. Thank you for your question. It's a very good one.
No worries, that's excellent. Thank you for that, Michael. I want to, if it's okay with you, Ken, I just want to pin this at Spotlight, continue. I just want to actually grab the screen for a sec.
Yeah, sure.
Share the screen just to show a couple of things to our audience in the webinar. Across to the Australian League of Rights website, it's not so much, okay, this is our front page, but the thing is that the libraries hold the works of Douglas. If we go back, we'll see the Social Credit Library. We've got an array of his writings here, most of them in PDF, and also, of course, the good work of Geoffrey Dobbs and Eric Butler. They're the big players in my view, but also the Internet of Things. I mean, the Internet of Things. I had this link sent to me the other day, the Kerr Palace Papers. and I downloaded the all the files, the 1 to 5, 1 to 5, 1 to 6. But in paper 2, part 2, when I downloaded it, what I was able to find in that lot was the thinking that Sir John Kerr had. I don't know if he was a Sir then, but either way, the thinking that the Governor General had at that time, that cataclysmic time in Australia where we had the collision of powers, the collision of powers. It was a desperate situation because Whitlam was attempting to deconstruct the power of the upper house. They are equal power in our constitution, except the upper house cannot initiate a financial bill, but they can do everything else the upper house can. And so when the Labor government in the lower house was pushing the Senate and the Senate held its ground, there was at loggerheads. It is that point where Sir John, as Governor General, looked at it, and in his writing he says he can't be seen to even be partial to one house or the other. Just recently before that, I believe a Queensland governor had done just that and had his commission removed, withdrawn. But Sir John Kerr did not. He knew where he stood, and he knew as a Supreme Court judge, he had that understanding of the Constitution, this balancing of power, which is really, really important, because that position, if you like, as headship over our government, our ministers minister to the Crown as that headship over government. It was his job to look at the situation, not take sides, but how could he resolve this great dilemma? And there was only one option, and that was where he was to remove the commission of the government and immediately give a commission to the alternative, the opposition, if you like. And before taking another step was to call for an election. To call for an election, he had to do those 3 steps virtually almost simultaneously, so that he couldn't be caught around behind, so that the existing government couldn't come around behind. They had to be dismissed. The new government had to be commissioned on the basis that they would hold the election. And this, to me, is the, if you like, it's the wonderful perspective, the Trinitarian perspective of holding power, of balancing it. And it's a reflection of the Godhead. It's the reflection, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that's right. Trinitarian relationship of you've got forces and things, but in it, you've got to hold it. So we talk about the point of freedom and security. We talk about freedom. We're seeing that in Victoria. We're seeing it being lunched. Freedom is going. They've got security in Victoria. It's called the police, and it's called locked in your house. They've got security, but no freedom. What is missing in that scenario, in that situation, is the balancing forces of morality. Now, the lower house is not being ethical. It is not being moral. You freedom, responsibility, freedom, security in a moral environment. That's what we're looking at. It's Trinitarianism. That's what it is. This is our Christian faith. And so the balancing of these forces, to me, is vital if we're going to understand our current situation and to work our way through this. Our constitutions are there for very good reason. They're there because we are inheriting the legacy of some deep and profound thinking. We have inherited. It's our constitution. 120 years ago, we're inheriting that. And it took a lot of time. Even the conventions took 10 years of how we're going to start establish federation. And so we had the Senate argument. It had to be the state's house. It had to be. So by the lower house passing a supply bill, they're actually answerable annually to the states, not the people. They're answerable annually to the states. The states can hold it up, and that's what happened in 75. And then in the end, it has to go back to the people. So I think that's really important. I think the study of this sort of, if you like, this balancing of powers is critical if we're going to work our way through the situation we've found ourselves in. So I think that's really important. Your thoughts, please, Michael.
Yes, that's good points, Arnis. Yeah, it is a deep topic that I think people today, particularly conservatives, people are interested in, people who want to advance the interests of conservative causes of Western civilization need to delve into the subject of governance and constitutionalism and the question of power and the balance of power, separation of powers, and they really need to go to the heart of the very structures around which we work in just at least just to have an understanding of what we're dealing with, I think, and it's a good point you made about with Governor General Kerr and with the release of these recent papers, which is a big revelation. That was really the last time, I think, when the Governor General of Australia truly exercised, probably in any of the Commonwealth, in all Commonwealth countries, that was the last time when power was exercised by Her Majesty's Governor General, on that scale. Whether they would get away with exercising it again is another question. But it just goes to show, if they have the will, if they at least have the will and the conviction, they can do that. They can exercise power as is their constitutional power to do so. So, yeah, that's a
very good point, Michael. I think that's an excellent point, because as soon as the October the 15th or 17th comes around, every year the headlines are that the government was sacked. But they weren't. They had their commission withdrawn, probably a technical term, but they were no longer in power. But they could have been re-elected by the people had the people appreciated them, but they weren't. We had a choice, and the Governor General really relieved the whole pressure.